Welcome back to the Lens and Legacy podcast, where we analyze the political and economic contents of various films from various decades. Today, we will be analyzing the movies from the 50s and 60s, Rebel Without a Cause, and The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. I'm joined by Tommy Lottie. Hello. And Nolan Wong. Hello. All right, let's get started. First, I think we want to transition this podcast into a bit of a question answer structure. And we can start by asking the question of how Jim Stark's struggle for identity reflects generational anxieties, especially in post-war America in the 1950s.
Yeah, so throughout the film, you see Jim Stark really just acting out in honestly very stereotypical ways of a teenager. And I think that reflects the growing power that the teenage market had in the 1950s with film and media, and how that these parents responded to the rapid change that they were experiencing. And originally, the film was made to actually reflect the degeneration of morals in teenagers. So it was almost meant to be targeted towards older audiences, but it really seemed to reflect and resonate a lot more with teenagers and youth.
You know, as you said, the degradation of culture in the U.S., but also the power of youth and rebellion really showing out in the 1950s. J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye came out in 1951, 4 years before this movie came out. And I feel like you can definitely see some of the influence there. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And you see the character of Jim Stark and Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, they align a lot in their ways that they both come from families of wealth and opportunity, and they have the opportunity to prosper, but they just don't really see where their parents are coming from, and they don't really have the ability to agree or to understand their point of view. And I think that's reflected in this movie.
And to add on to that, I feel like that the role of Jim Stark, he kind of embodies the dissatisfaction that a lot of teenagers in America felt in the 50s. And if you look into it, that in his household, he grew up in kind of like a unstable emotional state where his father was kind of passive and his mom was more controlling, which kind of left him without like kind of a strong like guidance and shape, and he kind of had to pave his own way, and showed like all the anxiety through like the family dynamics and kind of the broken home that he came from. And this kind of led to a struggle to like kind of like find himself and separate himself from the expectations that his parents brought and the societal expectations at the time. And that kind of showed more of a concern broader within the 50s with identity, finding himself in the modernizing America of the time.
Yeah, very true. And I think the film also offers critiques on concepts such as masculinity. I feel like that's a pretty major theme throughout the movie. So I guess my question is, how do the characters, more specifically perhaps Jim and Plato, offer contrasting models in the sense of male standards of the time, especially vulnerability?
Yeah, so Jim, played by James Dean, who was at this point just a massive star in Hollywood, especially among the youth, and his character, who is a vulnerable character and really wears his heart on his sleeve, kind of reflects the shifting away of the at this point, old view of masculinity, especially during the war times, of how men just kind of have to be quiet and deal with stuff. Whereas now you kind of see men, wanting to display their feelings more and relate and try and solve these problems instead of just moving past them. And Plato is very similar in that, in the way he attempts to face the problems that he has growing up as an orphan, and he was clearly depressed and has some form of antisocial personality disorder, how he attempts to reconcile that.
Yeah, very true. I think that the film definitely addresses questions of masculinity, especially in perhaps a new way that hadn't been addressed in the 40s. We saw pretty stereotypical male models in the movies such as Casablanca, where men act a certain way and they're always virtuous. But I think that idea is being challenged by a movie such as Rebel Without a Cause. But I think maybe moving into the influence of the film, in what ways does this film respond to a rise of suburban affluence and consumer culture, especially materialism becoming more prevalent in the 1950s?
Yeah, and something I will add is that it kind of shows a contrast between Jim and his father, as his father is more ineffective in his life and kind of just wasn't really there. And you could see like Jim kind of like shows emotion through like crying, seeking connections with others, and it kind of like contrasts the more like aggressive and conformative males around him at the time.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what that has to do with materialism and consumer culture, but it's an interesting point. But anywho, back to the original question. It shows like James Dean's iconic red leather jacket became a very iconic and defining look of the 50s, and the appearance of what the characters wear and the cars they drive and how they want to be presented outwardly, I think ties hand in hand with consumerism and how that was developing in the 50s, and the outward expression of yourself through material comforts and material goods.
Yeah, you kind of touched on the red leather jacket, and that's kind of the symbol of the whole film. And I think that kind of moves us into a question like about aesthetics and costume design and how those things amplify the film's social message. So I think perhaps there is, a start in film where costume design isn't simply what people would wear normally. I think we saw that with the Wizard of Oz in the 30s, that people before you enter Oz are just wearing what they would be in the day-to-day life. But now you kind of understand that this is a costume, and the costume is sort of a mask that characters slip into, and they become perhaps someone they're not, and actors have to conform to that role. So what do you think about the aesthetics of costume and color?
Yeah, especially the way the film is shot using cinema vision, I believe, which was it was one of the very first films to use this technology. And it's an ultra wide shot, rectangular in shape. And it really defines the way you see the movie. And I think you see that influence used throughout history, especially in a movie like La La Land, which directly references this using cinema vision. And it allows the colors and the costumes and the sets to really pop and mean more than just a setting or a costume. They become part of the film.
And something I will add is that there's a contrast if you look between the youth's fashion. It's more colorful and bright versus kind of like the blander or plain adult clothing. And that kind of emphasizes the divide between generations, not only in the way they dress, but kind of like through the movie, thematically. And yeah, again, like the bright red jacket, it's a symbol of kind of the intensity of rebellion and isolation that Jim experiences throughout the movie.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think that we're moving into a time of conscious costume selection and design, where people are understanding that what you wear, and I think this is reflective of a more materialistic time, but what you wear and the car that you drive and the home that you live in could be reflective of your character itself, and it can be something more than just I guess what clothing has been for most of history, just a way to cover up and be societally adept. I think that there's also a political commentary made by this film, and that's maybe a more obvious undertone. But we're in a time of Cold War paranoia and the era of McCarthyism in the U.S. So, what does rebellion, I guess the focal point of this movie, I mean it's in the title of the movie itself, represent and signify in the context of American ideology at the time?
Yeah, I think that rebellion means different things for the different ages in the film. For the teenagers, rebellion means independence, being your own self, living a life that you want, and rejecting what your parents have told you for years and forging your own path. And rebellion for the adults really means the lack of conformity and the disobedience to the rules and the kind of anarchical disruption of society that these youths, these rebels, trying to mess everything up and ruin a good thing. So I think that term rebel really is a term of endearment for youth and one of disgust for the adults. So I think it really highlights the anti-conformity of the youth and McCarthyism and the warring of generations.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think like the Cold War, obviously brings on later down the road in around 20 years or so, you see the Vietnam War, where youth are kind of the head of the protest movement, especially against the war. And I think maybe you're starting to see that kind of culture begin developing in the mid 1950s. And I think that it's an interesting transition from a film like this in the 50s to something like The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, where, we're looking at a Western, right, with Clint Eastwood. And the film, I would say, has a different lens, and it's maybe a call to old Hollywood, where Westerns were pretty much the start of the business. But how does the film reimagine the myth of the American West through a European lens? I think, we already kind of touch on this a little bit in Casablanca, the interconnectivity of the world as a whole. But does an outsider perspective, such as the Italian one, offer a different view on American capitalism, touching on developing trends of materialism and violence, especially another theme that's touched on in both films?
Yeah, so the film, directed by Sergio Leone, who at this point was relatively unknown in the Western scene, and this really was his big break. He is an Italian director, and so these movies get the term spaghetti Western, filmed in Italy. And in America, people like to believe the myth of the virtuous cowboy, the outlaw, the good guy, in the Civil War, and the Westerns were popular on TV at this point. And it really just offered a diluted lens of what was really happening at the time. And I think a movie like The Good, the Bad, the Ugly completely reimagines what that was, the Civil War in the Wild West, into a much more realistic and historically accurate take. And I think that's why the movie originally didn't really resonate with Americans, because they didn't want to be subjected to the reality of their country and the dark and murky past that this movie comes out of, and they like to stick with the more virtuous and cookie cutter Westerns, whereas this one is a lot grittier and changed the genre.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the film offers a different view on what Westerns were all about, and I think that's also reflective of the period at the time. Especially kind of the idea of war not being looked at as something that's patriotic, but more as something that should be looked down upon. And I think that something like the Civil War, especially with the context of slavery in the backdrop of the movie's entire narrative, I think it's interesting to explore the idea of how conflict is more presented as chaos and something run by elites as a business opportunity, and less so, an element of patriotism.
Yeah, so I think that rather than being shown as like a noble conflict, the war was kind of shown as pointless suffering, destruction, waste. And as you can see through like the main characters, Tuco and Blondie, they profit off these soldiers, and they impersonate military personas, and they treat the war as kind of background noise and not as big of a deal as other parts of the country may have treated in the world. And it shows kind of the absurdity of violence at the time, and mocks and frowns upon the idea that wars fought for noble causes and etc. So, the film definitely critiques maybe what significance a war plays in a country across the world and how different people view it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think the film is riddled with symbolism. More specifically, choices made by directors or composers who use things such as, once again, the costume design. But I think more specifically in this movie, we noted a use of music, especially the score by Morricone, to shape how we're supposed to feel about a character when they appear on screen. And that's something that, is consistently used in film today. But I think I want to look at perhaps the title of the movie, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as perhaps even just an allegory for how the symbolism of the film can influence the way you feel about a character. Can a character be good or bad just given by the music or their costume design and how they appear on screen?
I think you definitely hit on it with the movie title being a bit of an allegory. And it's interesting the way music is used in this film, especially how it almost becomes a character in and of itself. And it transcends what a score was in, Casablanca or Rebel Without a Cause, where it was mostly just background music. And in this movie, it really highlights kind of the emptiness and the silence of the West, and the music is really all you hear, and it's all you're focused on at times. And the music is used to try and represent each character's aura, if you will, and how that they're viewed by the people around them. So I think that the music really adds a level of complexity to your interpretation, where it was once black and white, both literally and figuratively with Casablanca. And this movie just seems to add a lot more vibrancy to the interpretation.
Yeah, building on that theme of symbolism, we know kind of one of the major symbols of the film, the gold being buried in the cemetery. And how does that symbolize perhaps the commentary on capitalism, right? Like the fact that gold and riches are buried in a cemetery. I think that is a pretty obvious note to perhaps a critique on capitalism, which might have been, prevalent for the time, but more specifically could have been something that was unusual for a film to come across as.
It's interesting the way that they come upon the gold in the cemetery, and how the only character who really knows where it is Blondie, and how he lies to the other characters to deceive them, and uses trickery, and in the end just uses pure force to kill the bad, and to ends up nearly hanging Tuco. So it shows that really to get to riches and wealth and power, you must use deceit and deception and force and crime to get to what you want. And really all it's going to lead you to is a cemetery. And I think that really symbolizes a lot of what they were trying to go for with that.
And additionally, the 60s were a dark time in the U.S. for a number of reasons, but more specifically, there was a sentiment of negativity around the ultra wealthy and Hollywood in general. I think that the 60s were also riddled with things such as the Manson murders, and the murder of Sharon Tate kind of rocked the industry as a whole. But the culture of hippies and the culture of some sort of antagonizing of the ultra wealthy and the elites in society, that is definitely a commentary that's being made by this film. I'd also like to move into one of our final questions. If the film could be interpreted as a metaphor for geopolitics and also the cost of building up empires that most countries, Western nations, were participating in at this time. Tommy?
Yeah. It's interesting how it can align with the Cold War, because you almost have this backdrop of the Union versus the Confederacy, almost in a Cold War sense. It could be the USSR versus the USA. And in between, the people really profiting off that are the ones who don't really have a dog in the fight and are just out for the money and the riches that can be gained from it. So I think it represents how these wars, this Cold War being fought, is really just opening the door for opportunists and people looking to build, capital in their own personal empires to really come in and get what they want from a situation where they're just focused on the war that they're fighting.
It's very interesting. I think as a closing, I wanted to see I think a theme of this project has been to analyze transitions and changes over time, especially through film, and how through the lens of Hollywood we're able to see the history of the U.S. and the world as a whole. What would you say is reflective of that change and transition?
One of the biggest things I noticed in the transition between a movie like Casablanca and a movie like The Good, the Bad, the Ugly is the scope at which it occurs. Casablanca takes place almost entirely in a nightclub in Casablanca, and it just goes from, Rick and Isla Lund just, meeting each other by chance and then getting her on a plane and sending her off. But this movie really goes on an odyssey across the American West through the Civil War, and it shows the growing power of film as a medium, as a storytelling medium, and as a metaphorical one. And I think that this film really signifies a massive turning point in the course of the history of film. And I think that shows the more artistic lens that film is heading towards.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think we had a great conversation today about these two films, and I think next week, as we start to dive into our films for the 70s and 80s, we're going to see a continued transition of a lot of those elements. Thank you, and we'll catch you in the next